Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron and welcome to today's discussion where we are going to be taking a look and making some predictions based on previous data about the opening weekend Ascendancy choices that players may make in the upcoming 3.20 Forbidden Sanctum League. If you enjoy the video discussion today, you can of course like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about future video discussions just like this one. And for the first time ever, we now have the option for you to join the G3 family through YouTube. And so you can of course find out more information by clicking the join button down below. If only I had as many plugs in my head as I have plugs at the intro to videos, I might have more hair. Anyway, with that bad pun out of the way, let's dive into today's discussion. My defense attorney father would be proud that we've got lots of disclaimers today. Our first disclaimer, of course, is a preview, that we are first going to take a look at data that we've collected, taking a look at snapshots of the 3.18 and 3.19 patch cycles in their opening 3-day weekends for Ascendancy meta selections that players made while pushing the experience ladder. First, we're going to look at the data, and then we're going to make some predictions based off that data. Where are we getting our data from, you might ask? Well, we're getting our data from two particular points. First off, we're using PoE Ninja and particular snapshots of Day 1, Day 2, and Day 3 of the Sentinel League and the Lake of Calandra League. And we're taking a look at the patch notes for the upcoming 3.20 Forbidden Sanctum League and comparing those particular pieces of data in order to make predictions based on the upcoming meta for Forbidden Sanctum. Our first data point is to simply look at a snapshot of Day 1, Day 2, and Day 3 from the Lake of Calandra 3.19. You can see the top 5 Ascendancies that remained in their spots in Day 1, Day 2, and Day 3 without much maneuvering whatsoever were the Inquisitor, the Elementalist, the Pathfinder, and the Deadeye. There was some changing in their particular levels of popularity, and you can notice the percentages change a little bit, but those 5 Ascendancies remained the top 5 dog Ascendancies over the opening weekend. We can observe in the changes from Day 1 to Day 2 that Inquisitor and Elementalist both stayed in their spots first and second place respectively, while Pathfinder and Deadeye both saw a little bit of drop, while Occultist picked up in its percentages and its placement on the ladder. Necromancer, Trickster, and Berserker also dipped a bit in their respective positions, while the Occultist, the Champion, the Ascendant, the Raider, and the Guardian gained a little bit of percentages in terms of their share space on the opening weekend ladder, ranging from Day 1 to Day 2. Things started to solidify much more clearly from Day 2 to Day 3. The Inquisitor, Elementalist, and Occultist firmly placed themselves as the top 3 dogs for the opening week of League starters during Lake of Calandra. Pathfinder and Deadeye swapped spots, and then the Assassin, Slayer, Gladiator, and Guardian, respectively, also swapped spots. Other than that, Ascendancies were pretty much locked in from Day 2 to Day 3. What's the story of the data that we're looking at from Lake of Calandra's opening weekend? Well, first off, we see that players, when they generally make a strong choice, don't change their league starters. What a shock, right? That one's obvious. But besides for that, we do see that players will make changes and certain Ascendancies will catch up in terms of their ladder experience gain faster than others in the league's progression once we hit the end of the campaign and begin mapping. So what does that mean for you moving forward? It might mean that certain Ascendancies and certain playstyles actually rush through the campaign faster than rushing through maps. And other Ascendancies and playstyles and skill gem combinations and builds might do better in maps than in the campaign. It is worth noting that relatively early on in a league, the meta is pretty firmly established. When you compare the various builds that are prevalent towards the end of the Lake of Calandra League versus the builds that began to emerge even within the first few days, you can generally begin to see the shape, at least Ascendancy-wise, of what is going to be popular throughout the league. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, you can see the way how a league is shaping up within the first few days of a league being played by the player base. Let's jump into our time machines and take a look back at the 3.18 league cycle, Path of Exile Sentinel League. Now, during Sentinel, things looked a lot different than during the Lake of Calandra. There were some major patch shakeups that changed the way how players chose to interact and build out their Ascendancies during the opening weekend. For instance, as soon as we look at the data overview, we can see the Saboteur, the Necromancer, the Inquisitor, the Elementalist, and the Deadeye round out for the top 5 spots for the opening weekend of the Sentinel League. It is most noteworthy of us to make an observation as we are looking at this data to see that both the Necromancer and the Saboteur were not within the top 5 spots, or even really were vying for those top 5 spots once we got around to Lake of Calandra. Generally speaking, when stuff gets hit in the patch notes relatively hard, it dips, it drops. There is a significant change in the way how players perceive the power of a specific ascendancy when there are announced changes in a patch note cycle. That's going to be key for us to observe making predictions moving forward. In other words, if you see an ascendancy get smacked real hard in patch notes, then those of you who are ancient and geriatric Path of Exile players like me, you know that generally players are going to move away from that ascendancy that's been smacked real hard in patch notes. Conversely, though, the opposite is also true. If something doesn't get hit very hard in patch notes, certain ascendancies can maintain their top dog status for a very long and extended period of time, such as like the Elementalist. That whole year during the incursion cycle that basically stayed top dog or top 5 certainly, and so on and so forth from other leagues like Necromancer, like Champion, even like Guardian for a time. Different ascendancies enjoy their particular moment, 15 minutes or 15 moments or 15 leagues of fame in the top 5 player popular ascendancy choices, especially during the opening weekend, based on patch notes. The major changes and shakeups from day 1 to day 2 during the Sentinel League were that the Deadeye, the Pathfinder, the Gladiator, and the Trickster all lost positions, moving from day 1 to day 2, while the Champion, Occultist, Raider, Slayer, and Juggernaut all gained spots in terms of their player share on the experience ladder. Day 2 to day 3 for Sentinel looked very different than for Lake of Calandra. You see in the middle portions of the Ascendancy a lot of moving around. The Deadeye, the Raider, the Pathfinder, the Slayer, the Gladiator all lost ground, while the Occultist, the Ascendant, the Hierophant, and the Assassin all gained ground. On either opposite ends of the spectrum, being the top end or the low end, there was pretty much a firmly in place meta already coming into shape moving from day 2 to day 3 of 318 Sentinel League. One note that's interesting to make here during Sentinel was that Saboteur continually dropped its player percentage share on the experience ladder, going down from day 2 to day 3 from 20% to 18%. And that trend generally continues amongst players who are playing traps. A lot of players like to play traps early on in the league because you can simply rush and get through several different map bosses early on with any sort of trap build on a very, very budget scale. It doesn't take much stats to get traps really going and start opening up and unlocking your Atlas passives using various combinations of traps. And so oftentimes players on a budget will choose to league start with Saboteur or with some version of traps, and then will swap out of that as they build currency and continue to progress their Atlas and discover for themselves what playstyle they would like to major on for the next character that they'd like to play. Sentinel's opening weekend was, again, pretty well defined between its top 5 spots. There was that slight swap from Deadeye to Champion that we see day 1. Deadeye and Champion were deadlocked, as it were, in a tie for the 5th spot. But by the time day 3 rolled around, Deadeye moves down from 7% of the player share down to 5%, while Champion grew from 7% up to 9%, taking that 5th spot. Elementalist, Inquisitor, Necromancer, and Saboteur all stayed in their respective spots, but Necromancers grew in their player share from day 2 to day 3, while Saboteurs lost their player share. Necromancer's little sister, the Elementalist, also grew in her player share from 11 to 12% from day 2 to day 3. So side by side, when we take a look at Sentinel and Lake of Calandra, this is what they looked like on day 1, day 2, and day 3, respectively, in their top 5 most played Ascendancy choices. During the Lake of Calandra, it was basically Occultist, Deadeye, Pathfinder, Elementalist, and Inquisitor. Whereas for Sentinel, you've got Saboteur and Necromancer, but you've got several familiar faces when the Elementalist and Inquisitor pop in, with the occasional Champion also showing up. It's worthy to notice that the Champion is also sometimes hanging around during Lake of Calandra, and of course came up throughout the league multiple times through multiple different builds. So maybe Champion isn't quite top 5 worthy at the moment, but kind of hanging around there. It'll be interesting to keep an eye on Champion throughout the upcoming league. One potential change and one potential prediction moving forward is that, of course, with the 320 patch notes, there was this change to the Inquisitor. Remember what we said about how changes in patch notes to specific ascendancies often can change players' reception or decisions to interact with that particular ascendancy. Here's what the change is coming for the only major change to any ascendancy in 320. The following is written regarding the problem of the Inquisitor. The recovery provided by the consecrated ground you create causes life regeneration to also recover energy shield for you and your allies on Pious Path is significant on its own, so having 50% increased effect of consecrated ground you create on top of this feels overboard. The solution that Grinding Gear Games has provided is, of course, a nerf. The nerf to Inquisitor's Pious Path Ascendancy passive, as it no longer will read 50% increased effect of consecrated ground you create. This is something of a big deal to certain build types, like maybe, let's say, Righteous Fire, or let's say a Sparker that just wanted to stand still and depend on life regeneration, specifically through consecrated ground in order to stay alive. Other than that, though, this is not that much of a change. If you have got any time and any amount of years spent playing Path of Exile, then you know if this is the only nerf that's coming to Ascendancies in 320 Forbidden Sanctum League, this is not much of a smackdown. This does not compare to any of the sorts of smackdowns that we saw when Slayer lost its leech, when various other sorts of ascendancies lost their entire defensive mechanics, when certain other ascendancies, lost the definitive thing that made them an ascendancy itself. So to sum up, in comparing Sentinel and Lake of Calandra on the Inquisitor really probably is going to be up there once again for 320. Yeah, this is something of a hit, and players will see it as a hit and therefore will back off a little bit. But in terms of the size of a hit that it is, it really doesn't compare to many more of the other nerfs that we've seen throughout the history of Path of Exile. So I expect Inquisitor to be lower in its overall player count, but I don't expect it to drop out of the top 5. But more on that when we make some predictions in a moment. All right, since I've come back to Path of Exile, a lot of you know, and those of you who do know me, know that I love to play minions. That is basically the number one thing that drew me into Path of Exile back in the day when I was coming in to look for a different action RPG where I could genuinely feel like I was a general of an undead horde. And Path of Exile was the action RPG that allowed me to do that. Certain other action RPGs didn't allow me to do that. They just allowed me to feel like I was channeling and had one ginormous pet walking along with me. But that action RPG will remain nameless for the duration of today's discussion. The Necromancer has not seen many buffs lately, but they have seen something of some nerfs. In fact, during my year of time away from Path of Exile, they've lost the one big thing that they had going for them, particularly for scaling up minions and their levels, which was unnatural strength, giving your minion gems +2 levels. That was simply bonkers and ridiculous, and they've lost that. And we see the change between Sentinel to Lake of Calandra. Not having that particular buff made an incredibly popular ascendancy drop out of the top 5, something that would have normally been taking either the first or the second most popular spots, even on opening weekend, even maybe potentially competing with those saboteurs that love to rush maps. Necromancer and the changes as well to Detonate Dead, as well as the Ascendancy for minion power level, have made it so that way the Necromancer overall is much, much less appealing as a league starter on the opening weekend for players that are going to push for ladder. For the rest of us, I think it's still viable. I'm probably going to be playing some Necromancers when I'm playing Ruthless League, but at least for the opening weekend, I do not expect the Necromancer to make the top 5, especially since we haven't seen any buffs specifically to Necromancers, Summoners, or Minions in general in the 320 patch notes. So let's make some more predictions. So, if we're predicting that the 320 Ascendancy for the opening weekend of Forbidden Sanctum is going to be anything, it's going to be maybe potentially in these categories. Let's make some predictions. These are my best educated guesses on these particular following topics. My best guess will be made for will remain in the top 5 played. This is sort of like, imagine if we were in an awards ceremony sort of thing. That's the way how I'm kind of framing the nature of this discussion. Secondly, we will see my best guess for was not in the top 5 during 318 or 319, but will be for 320's opening weekend. And thirdly, we're going to see my best guess for most likely to fall out of the top 5. I would love to hear what your particular best guesses are for each of these categories. What are your best guesses for will remain in the top 5? will not be in the top 5 for Sentinel or Lake of Calandra, but might crop up into the top 5 for Forbidden Sanctum. And I'd love to hear your best guess for what is most likely to fall out of the top 5. All right. With all of those invitations to drop me your predictions down below, here are mine, and we'll be able to go and laugh at these in just a few days when they're all proven wrong. As I tell Mrs. Draconis all too often, I've been wrong before, I'll be wrong again. Let's find out if I'm about to be wrong right now. My best guess for will remain in the top 5 played is the Inquisitor. I think the Inquisitor and the nerfs coming to it through the patch notes are actually not sufficient enough to make players run away from it, to make players scared, to essentially make players choose not to play Inquisitor. There are so many amazing buffs that you get by playing Inquisitor, especially as a league starter, that you can access later on in a league when you're a wealthier player, but you can't early on when you're trying to gear and trying to gain currency in a softcore trade environment, that I think the Inquisitor is still going to remain a strong option for players that want to play such hallmark builds as, let's say, Righteous Fire, maybe Spark, maybe even using something like Absolution, maybe using other lightning-based skills. That could be interesting. I think a lot of players at the moment only see nerfs as being, well, not sizable. It's just not enough, the nerfs that came through. Now, that might sound crazy counterintuitive, like, oh, Iron, it sounds like you're asking GGG to nerf the Inquisitor more. I'm not doing that. I'm simply saying it sounds like the nerf that was applied to Inquisitor might actually hit the goal of what GGG was aiming for with the nerf towards its Pious Path particular node. Maybe that nerf in and of itself will draw enough of the player base back so that way the Inquisitor doesn't take the top 2 spots, but I don't think the Inquisitor is going to drop all the way down outside of the top 5. I could be wrong, but I think top 5 is where the Inquisitor is going to remain. Next up is my best guess for was not in the top 5 during 318 or 319, but will be for 320. Here's the drum roll, and the reveal is the Berserker. That's right. I think there is a ton of buffs that are coming to us in 320 Forbidden Sanctum for melee players, including some of those new flashy and awesome Vol skills. And I think players are going to want to try those on characters that can dish out a ton of damage. Specifically, I think Vol Cleave being able to have a headhunter buff built into your build right away from the get-go, not having access to any currency, just being able to kill rares and then steal their buffs for a time. I think that's going to be pretty awesome, pretty powerful, and that means you're going to need to be able to do damage. And in a softcore environment, what character can do damage in a faster way through an attack-based skill than the Berserker? I think Berserker might actually see some gameplay in the upcoming opening weekend for racing purposes. My best guess for most likely to fall out of the top 5 is the Elementalist, the Necromancer's little sister. It's possible that the Elementalist remains in. There are enough numerous other archetypes that are still available for the Elementalist. Get it? That's an intended pun there. Shout out to Enki. There are plenty of other archetypes that are available for the Elementalist to be able to play other than Lightning Conduit. But I think one of the things that the Elementalist is going to suffer from is going to be potentially player fatigue or simply other various archetypes coming up in terms of their rising in their ascendancy, we might say, or rising in their popularity. I think the Elementalist doesn't offer enough on her own at the moment to stay inside the top 5. I think there's going to be too many other ascendancies and too many other build styles and play styles that are simply more attractive. So if I've got to guess which one's going to fall out of the top 5, my guess is going to be the Elementalist. I'm sure a lot of you out there are going to guess Inquisitor, but this is the one that I've decided to pick for today. A potential top 5 from the opening weekend in terms of ascendancy choices could therefore look like the following: Inquisitor, Occultist, Champion, Pathfinder, and Berserker. Of course, I've been wrong before, and I could be wrong again. We're going to find out in a few days if I was wrong right now. And boy, it's going to be funny to go back and look at this and see just how wrong I was, most likely. Feel free to include your top 5 guesses on what you think the opening weekend Ascendancy meta is going to look like down in the comments below. Thanks so much for joining us today for the discussion. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your opinions, your critiques, and your feedback down below in the comments. I do my best to get back to everybody that takes the time to comment. And so thanks so much for participating in today's discussion. And let me know if you've got any feedback, any critiques, or any comments, or maybe you're just looking at all of my predictions and simply saying, my goodness, I couldn't believe it. I actually agreed with every single word that G3 Iron said today. That'd be awesome. That would be incredible. And if that's you, then I hope the upcoming 320 Forbidden Sanctum League is the league. A Mirror of Calandra drops for you. Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.